Hi there, and welcome to the Cotswold Explorer. I'm Robin Shuckburgh, and we are exploring the beautiful region of the Cotswolds in southwest England, following in the trail of Herbert Evans, who cycled around this region and wrote about his experiences in this wonderful book, The Highways and Byways in Oxford and the Cotswolds, published in 1905, 114 years ago. We're going to find out how things have changed in all those years. We'll visit the lovely stone towns and villages. We'll drive down the winding country lanes. We'll look in on many of the magnificent stately homes in the area. We'll talk to some of the local businesses. We'll examine the history of the local churches, of which there are millions. And we'll discover what it is that makes the Cotswolds one of the most famous tourist destinations in the entire world. You find Ross, Widget and me today in the centre of Oxford, outside the incredible Ashmolean Museum. Now, Evans started his journey by describing the great city of Oxford. However, many more learned commentators than I have written tomes about the beautiful city of dreaming spires, and I really think it's probably best that you refer to them if you want to know about Oxford itself. And meanwhile, we are going to head for the beautiful town of Woodstock. Follow me. Well, we're heading west on our way to Woodstock. We're driving up the Woodstock Road in Oxford. We will be passing through the sort of southern side of Summertown, which in the time of Evans was a brand new residential suburb of Oxford, but is now very much part of the city of Oxford. Strangely enough, it's one of the most expensive places to live in the whole of the country. And you can, driving through it, you can tell why. It's full of wonderful open spaces, green trees, well, at least it is in the summer. And the houses are large and comfortable. On our way west towards Woodstock, we've stopped off a little village called Yarnton. We've driven into the old part of the village, and this beautiful church you see behind me is quite seriously well worth a visit. Most of the churches in this part of the world during the Reformation were stripped of an enormous amount of their decoration, particularly murals and those sorts of things on the walls. This church seems to have come out pretty unscathed. It's stunning in there. There's some very ancient mural work on the wall. The glass looks very much original in design. It's a fascinating place to visit. In one of the chapels you will find two memorials to the Spencer family. Now, these are relations of Lady Diana, which of course at the time of Mr. Evans would not have been relevant, but they are brothers and sisters of the Spencers of Althorpe. Behind me on my right is the Manor House, a stunning house, well worth looking at from out here. Yarnton is worth dropping off at. Just outside the church door is this unusually elaborate stone cross. You can just see on the base 4 knights kneeling on one knee, and on the shaft canopied figures of ecclesiastics. There's another one like it in the churchyard at Ensham, a few miles south of here, and there will have been a few more in between, now long lost to the plough. They mark the stopping points for medieval religious processions. I'm sure we'll come across more examples of these crosses in our travels. I'm quite surprised in a way, never having been here before, and in particular because Evans writes of it. I will read this to you. Although no events of national import have given Yarnton a place in the pages of history, the night of June the 3rd, 1644, must have been long remembered by the villagers. It was on this night that the king, at the head of 3,000 horse and 2,500 foot, made his memorable dash from Oxford between the two armies destined by the Parliament to complete the circumvallation of the city. He'd been based in Oxford, and he was just on the verge of being laid siege to by the parliamentarian armies. They were closing in a kind of pincer movement, and one night he took his entire army out of Oxford and went down this valley just behind us here to get out without being seen by the parliamentarian armies. He reached Longhambra, crossed the Even Lode, and made it to Burford, and thence onwards. Of course, it didn't save him for long, but it was a remarkable achievement at the time. Yarnton, a surprising treat. To find the ancestors of Lady Diana Spencer, or Princess Di as the world now remembers her, possibly the single most iconic personality of the 20th century, lurking unknown, certainly to this traveller, in this lovely church in the village of Yarnton, is surely a wonderful omen for our journey to come. It seems the manor came into the possession of the Spencer family in the time of Queen Elizabeth, and they lived here for 4 generations. Moving on towards Woodstock, we cross what used to be called Campsfield's Plain. This flat land, probably always free of forest, was used by the early undergraduates of Oxford to practice their horsemanship and to race one another for the thrills and for money. These days it holds Oxford Airport. So here we are. We've arrived in the beautiful village of Woodstock. We've come past Yarnton and the Campsfield Plains. We're only a few miles from Oxford, but we're now in an absolutely classic Cotswold village. This was built up, this village, as a stockade in amongst the forests in the very early days. It's a village that has had royal patronage for a very, very long time. There was a royal palace here long before Blenheim Palace, which exists at the moment, and we will show you shortly, existed. It has since been demolished, but it meant that this little town here had a wealth and structure about it from very, very early times. In modern day, of course, Woodstock really relies largely on tourism. It has a wonderful selection of hotels. There's one behind me called the Bear, which is the oldest hotel in the village. It's an ancient 1300s, it stems from. Old coaching inn. It's a wonderful place. But there are several hotels in this village. Also shops, antique shops, great clothes shops, that sort of stuff. And we'll show it all to you. Come with me. You can tell by just looking at it that Woodstock has always been a prosperous village. Royal patronage over the generations made a huge difference. Ancient coaching inns, all now brought up to 21st century standards, offer great accommodation to the visitor, and restaurants, shops and galleries abound to keep the traveller happy for a while. The Oxfordshire Museum behind me is a great facility in Woodstock. It has all kinds of things. There's a great cafe here, there's a brilliant art gallery, and exhibitions given of various kinds throughout the year. It's quite a facility and definitely worth a visit. Behind me is one of the most famous of the buildings in the village of Woodstock. It's called Chaucer's Cottage. Its connection with Geoffrey Chaucer is fairly tenuous. It seems to belong to the wife of his son. Whether or not any of the Chaucers ever lived here is a little bit dubious, but such is the power of the name, of course, that it's still here. Chaucer's Lane is the little lane that runs down behind me. It's a classic Cotswold cottage and very beautiful. So we've walked straight from the high street of Woodstock through this wonderful arch and into what must be one of the most beautiful parks in the world. This is the most astonishing view, the palace behind me and the lake behind me. Now, I'm going to leave. If you want to know more about Blenheim Palace, really there are better people to tell you than I. And so we're not going to go into any great detail about the palace itself. But it does have a couple of interesting stories from here. The bridge behind me was first built over the stream. It was just a stream with a marshy land around it, and it was built as a kind of viaduct so people could get across the marshes. It was when Capability Brown redesigned this park that he dammed the stream and flooded the valley behind me, creating under this bridge this lake that you see. It was an extraordinarily brilliant thing to do. Last year, 2018, They had to dredge this lake because naturally the stream is silting it up all the time. They drained it, they took out millions of tons of soil, but in doing so they discovered that the bottom of this bridge behind me is made up of lots of different rooms. Initially, when it wasn't supposed to be in the middle of a lake, they designed this bridge to have rooms for entertainment. Apparently there's even a little theatre in there. All drowned again now, of course, all underwater.
On the far side of the lake once stood the old palace. Nothing's left of it now, but it was a royal palace from the time of Ethelred II to Charles I, before the first Duchess of Marlborough had it removed. Partly, it seems, to spite the architects of Blenheim who wanted to restore it. They didn't have the best of relationships. It was in the gatehouse of this old palace that Elizabeth, before she became queen, was imprisoned for a year by her sister Queen Mary, under suspicion of having been involved in the plot against the throne by Thomas Wyatt. People will always argue about the architectural qualities of Blenheim. To some it's a huge, heavy monstrosity. To others an amazing exercise in architectural symmetry. Evans writes, somewhat diplomatically, "I will only say that in the magnificent strength of its solid proportions and in the imposing severity of its classic design, it is a fitting monument both of its age and of the military hero in whose honour it was erected." I'm not sure he was a fan. Since the 16th century, the village was renowned for the quality of its handmade gloves. There was something in the water of the stream that allowed the local cottagers to make the softest gloves anywhere. Anthony Wood, the 17th century antiquary, wrote of the stream, "It hath so great virtue therein, that all the skins of a more delicate kind are so well seasoned with it for the making of white leather, that none whiter, softer, or better is hardly found." Gloves have been a bit out of fashion for a while now, and I'm not sure we'll ever see the like of that again.
We've had a nice time in Woodstock. It's a great place. It's well worth a visit. Remember, it's quite busy, so if you do come here, remember to allow yourself a little bit of time to find a parking space. But the palace is amazing. In normal circumstances, we'd have used a drone here. As you go through this film, you will discover we use a drone a lot in our filming of the villages of the Cotswolds. But not here. We're too close to the airport that we saw earlier on. Campsfield is just a little bit too near. So we're being very responsible. We're heading north now towards Banbury via all kinds of small, fascinating villages and over the Cotswold Hills. Come with me. So we followed Evans's trail on the by-roads due north out of Woodstock, and it's brought us out onto the main road between Oxford and Banbury by a pub called Sturdy's Castle, which you see behind me. Mentioned in this book 110 years ago, he stopped here to have a drink, refresh himself on his bicycle. It's now become a wonderful hotel. Quite a good place to base yourself. We're going to head now north of here towards Banbury, sliding off the main road into Steeple, Aston, and then on to Deddington and Adderbury. Two wonderful towns, villages really, but they are called towns. And we're going to look at the extraordinary change in the architecture and the stone. Come with me. We've taken a small detour off the main road from Oxford to Banbury to visit a beautiful house called Rousham. This house has been lived in by the same family as long as almost any other house in the whole county. It's still lived in by Charles Cottrell Dormer, and it's surrounded by gardens designed by the famous garden designer William Kent in the 1730s. It's an extraordinary place and a wonderful informal visit. You can come here to visit the gardens. No children under 15, by the way, and certainly no dogs. But it's for a small fee, which you simply slot your money into a machine, you can visit and walk around these amazing, amazing gardens. It's well worth the short detour off the main road. So here we are, just about a mile across the valley from Rousham. We're now in the village of Steeple, Aston. You can see behind me the church, which we will be visiting in a moment. It's a lovely village, this, in the folds of the hills, very steep lanes, lots of very, very pretty Cotswold stone houses. It's a village well worth visiting, small and quiet and peaceful and lovely. It's a pretty place. It's on the way to the selection of villages around Banbury, which we will be filming in the near future. Meanwhile, there's an interesting story about the inside of this church. Follow me and I'll show you.
Inside this lovely church is a memorial to a notorious hanging judge who died in 1741. His name was Sir Francis Page, and Evans writes of this monument: "It was erected by the judge in his lifetime to perpetuate the memory of himself and his wife." It says much for the complacence of the rector and church wardens of the day that he was allowed to destroy existing monuments to make room for it. Events proved that he was wise in erecting this monument, for on the death of his bachelor nephew and heir, his estate passed into other hands and the judge's mansion was destroyed. This church is the proud owner of a 14th century cope, an embroidered semicircular cloak to be worn by an important cleric during the frequent great processions that took place then. It's an extremely rare survivor, and since the 1890s it has lived most of its time in the Victoria and Albert Museum in London, making occasional appearances in Steeple, Aston for fundraising purposes. Outside the door of the church we find what looks very much to me like another of those unusual crosses we discovered by the church in Yarnton, which marked the stopping points for medieval pilgrims during their aforementioned processions. I remember saying at the time that we were likely to find more of these on our travels. Like most of the villages in this region, there are signs of Iron Age settlement here in Steeple Aston, and considerable evidence of Roman and Saxon activity. Of course, it was mentioned in William the Conqueror's Doomsday Book in 1086, and it was at the forefront of educational revolution, building its first school in 1640. In the 20th century, many new houses were built here, and it had become one of the most sought-after villages to live in. Iris Murdoch and her husband John Bailey lived here at Cedar Lodge for 30 years, and in that century its neighbour, the Upper Hayford US Air Force Base, brought many American residents to the village, who played a great part in the community. The base is now closed, and the quiet skies go some way towards making up for the loss of the much-enjoyed visitors from the States. Just a couple of miles north of Steeple Aston is the village of Deddington. The first and most extraordinary thing you notice about Deddington is its colour. You get the impression you're suddenly in a golden world, where the buildings glow in the sunshine, unlike anything you've ever seen before. The reason is soon apparent. The stone from which these houses are built comes from quarries nearby which are so rich in minerals that they're unique in the region. Evans, over 100 years ago, writes of Deddington, "Time was when Deddington must have been a paradise for a painter. But times have changed. Like so many other ancient settlements in this district, Deddington is a decayed market town." These days we'd question his analysis, of course, but what he saw at the time was the beautiful ancient golden buildings surrounded by Victorian red brick and slate houses, seen by him as a nasty modern intrusion into the local vernacular. We're at last able to use our beloved drone, as we're outside any restricted area, and we're flying off the ancient castle site. The church in Deddington has extraordinarily wide nave and aisles, while the chancel is particularly narrow, but its overall impression is of wonderful spaciousness and light. The steps in the jambs of the windows, both north and south, look incongruous, but they were once the steps to the galleries in rood screens, ornate divisions enclosing chapels at the end of both aisles. This church is not by any means the most spectacular in the region, but it's certainly one of the most spiritual and restful. Going north, we pass through Adderbury, another lovely village built from the local gold and stone. Its church is one of the finest in the region, with a wonderful spire, but hidden somewhat by the builders who were working here when we visited. Its interior is less vandalised than some, but evidence of murals on the walls shows how much plaster and decoration was removed during the Reformation. But a visit to the interior provides a fascinating tale.
The tablet on my right on the ground here is in memory of a man called William Olds. He was a vicar here during the Civil War. He was a staunch royalist, so much so that he was a wanted man by the parliamentarians, to the extent that he had to leave his home and take refuge in Banbury, which was at that time a royalist stronghold, until the day when his son was due to go to Winchester, to college for the first time. And he wrote a message to his wife saying that he would like to ride with them for a while to see his son off to his education. Unfortunately, one of the local residents here intercepted the message, discovered that he was going to be there. So when they started their journey, they'd only got about a mile outside the village when they saw in the distance some soldiers. Olds told his wife and son to go on ahead, and as they passed them, if they turned out to be royalist friends, that they should wave and he would come and join them. Unfortunately, when they got there, they made no sign at all. So the vicar turned his horse round and galloped as fast as he could, back towards Banbury and refuge. The soldiers saw him leave and gave chase. The vicar was clever. On the way, he threw his money, such as he had, onto the road behind him. And all the soldiers but one were tempted by this to stop and pick up the money, except one, who followed him at full gallop towards Adderbury. As he came into the village, fully intent on riding straight through for Banbury, his horse, recognizing his home, decided that under no circumstances would he go any further, however much he was spurred or whipped, which gave the soldier time to catch him up, and he shot him on the spot, dead. A tragic end to a man who was clearly a lovely family man. There is some embroidery to this story from the local villagers. It is said that the man who betrayed him fell dead only a matter of a couple of weeks later on the very spot on which Reverend Olds was shot. I have a suspicion that if there's any truth to that story, someone must have helped him on his way. As we leave Adderbury Church, our visit only slightly impeded by the restoration work that's going on here, and pleased that their work means that your visit in the future will be all the better for it. You might have expected us to travel just a couple of miles north of here to Banbury. Indeed, our indispensable guide, Evans, from over 100 years ago, chose Banbury as his base for a few days. But we've decided not to visit this important town, and you deserve an explanation for this. I'm absolutely certain that Banbury's full of worthy people running wonderful businesses, and they'd be delighted, of course, to see you. And whilst the town is certainly one of the most important in Oxfordshire, famous, of course, for its cross and its cakes, for us it's just a step too far from the Cotswolds. Also, at the risk of visiting the sins of the fathers upon the sons, it is the site of two of the greatest acts of vandalism in the history of the county. The magnificent castle was entirely demolished after the Civil War, probably the most important royalist stronghold in the whole country. But less understandably, and perhaps more importantly, the beautiful cathedral-like church, widely thought of as one of the finest in Oxfordshire, was demolished in 1790 by the burghers of Banbury, simply for the want of a little money for running repairs.
Of its replacement, Evans writes as follows: "The stranger who inquires his way to the church will find to his amazement a hideous square mass of stone without form or proportion. If he enters, he will not care to linger, for he will soon have seen enough to convince him that he has at last reached the nadir of ecclesiastical architecture." So we are not going to subject you to it.
Instead, we're going to head due west of here to the first of several small villages that surround Banbury and have interesting stories to tell. It's called Bloxham. Come with me.
As we head towards Bloxham, we're driving along the ridge between the Sware River and the old Cotswold railway line. On our left you can see the masts of a 20th century communications centre, and to the right the remains of the railway that served the mines and smelters of Hook Norton, which we will visit later in our journey. The railway was closed down in the 1960s when the politician Richard Beeching cut huge swathes through the rail networks of Britain. Evans writes of Bloxham, "The Bloxham people are naturally proud of their lofty, crocketed spire. Round the octagonal base from which it springs is a broad band of elaborately carved stonework, which they call the Alice. When viewed from a distance, this band has all the effect of a wreath, loosely encircling the spire. Inside the church, we're struck by the light that streams in through the lofty, clear windows, particularly in the south transept, known as the Thornycroft Chapel, giving an atmosphere of peace and tranquillity, and lighting up the marble image of Sir John Thornycroft, resplendent in flowing wig and loose mourning gown. He lived, in the 17th and 18th centuries, in Milcombe Manor, about 2 miles south of here." After a brief but fascinating visit to the small local museum right next to the church, we're now heading south to Milcombe to have a look at Thornycroft's Dovecote.
The Milcombe Dovecote, which you can see behind me, was built by John Thornycroft when his manor was in this village. His manor house is long gone. The Dovecote was an important part of their lives in those days because the idea of feeding animals through the winter had not really been established. So the meat availability was extremely limited during the winter. And so the pigeon offered a constant supply of meat. So the landed gentry around here built pigeon lofts like the one behind me, this big dovecote, and they bred pigeons for the table. They were the only ones allowed to do it. Of course, they didn't allow their tenants to have any kind of access to these birds because the birds had long since been recognized as a pest for their crops. But the rich needed their meat. And that's what this building is all about. We'll come across several more of them in our travels. You may remember one at Rousham. We will no doubt discover many more.
Sadly, it's difficult to get to see the inside of this dovecote. It belongs to the Cherwell District Council, and the rules appear to stipulate that to get inside, one must apply for a key and then be accompanied by an officer of the council. The doorway shows little sign of having been opened in the last few years. Broughton Castle is the home of the Fiennes family, lords of Say and Seal. In the 15th century, William Fiennes, the second Baron Say and Seal, married the great-great-granddaughter of the sister of the founder of New College, Oxford, William of Wykeham. She brought the castle with her. William's father, the first Baron, was the unpopular Lord Say in Shakespeare's Henry VI, who was beheaded by Jack Cade. During the Civil War, the Fiennes family was strongly parliamentarian, and they raised a small army known as Lord Say's Bluecoats, who did good service at the Battle of Edge Hill, but surrendered to the king shortly afterwards. There is a room at the top of the castle still known as the Barracks, where the soldiers were billeted. Next time, via the village of Roxton, we'll visit Edge Hill, the site of one of the most important battles in the Civil War, and where my ancestor, Richard of Shuckburgh, fought with such distinction that come the Restoration his son was knighted by Charles II and subsequently promoted to the baronetcy. Then we'll drop south to Compton Winyates, Shipston-on-Stour, Great Wolford and Hook Norton, where we'll be visiting the famous brewery. We'll see you then.